I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with you and maybe give you a little bit different perspective on what we see in the private sector and what we see at the state level as well, and how we need to come together to find solutions to some of the major problems facing our state. I'm a firm, and some of you might disagree with this, but I'm a firm believer in local control and local government having control over land use. I think, generally speaking, in almost all cases, government closer to the people, you get better outcome. And so I'm a firm believer in that. But we at the state, we are also challenged. We have a challenge where we have to look at the big picture, and we can't look at just what happens within our own particular cities. We have to look, how do we make everything work? How do we make economic development work? How do we make that retail work? How do we make everything work to come together to the benefit of the citizens of the state? And how do we take into considerations the quality of life issues that we face as a state on the big picture, whether it be air quality, whether it be transportation, and so on and so forth. And so I've spent the last couple of years as chair of transportation, when I was chair of the transportation committee, looking at what can solve the transportation problems that face the state, as well as what well, not maybe how can we solve it, but how can we make it better and keep our quality of life good as we expect here in the state of Utah, when we're looking at doubling our state's population over the next 30, 35 years, at least along the Wasatch Front in that time frame. And so how can we reduce vehicle miles traveled per capita? How can we provide housing for our kids and our grandkids? And those types of things. And one of the things that we looked at as a whole is transit lines, mass transit, and different things as far as public transportation. One thing that I'm from Hooper. I've got my cowboy boots on. You don't see me on a public transport using public transportation, and so I'm not. Prior to coming into this role, I've never really grasped the concept of public transportation until just recently, when UDOT told our committee that we was working on, that we cannot build enough roads to meet the demands that are about to hit us with our state's population. That clicked for me. At that point in time, it clicked for me, and I remember thinking that we have got to think outside of the box, and what are the tools that we can do to do that. And as we dove into this issue, a couple of the things that really made an impact on me, and that I remember, and the things that I think will make a big difference is, one, how do we work with mass transit, and how do we work with land development, and how do we combine the two to make them effective? And just a quick example on mass transit, we're currently spending approximately 90% of the fare, or the cost for mass transit in this state is costing the taxpayer itself approximately 90% of the cost is being borne by the average, or by all taxpayers, and not the fare, not being recovered from the fare box. Only 10% is being recovered from the fare box. And so how do we make mass transit become a more viable option and not just a burden to the average taxpayer? And I think the biggest way we can do that is by working on land use around the stops to make them more effective, to work on transit-oriented developments, to put people close to the transit stops, to give them ability so that they don't have to have two cars in every house, so that maybe they can have one car and the other person in the house, or the other kids in the house, can use transit as a viable option. And I think that's one way that'll help increase ridership, increase fare box recovery, and really go a long ways to taking some cars off our roads to where we can meet the demands of the growing population that we're looking at. And just one last point I want to look on it, or hit on, is I think that the state, as we look at these options and we look at these challenges, I think that we need to set the goals as a state, but yet give the ability to the cities the tools that they need to achieve the goals and create the framework to help them achieve those goals. And so it's not being forced upon the local governments by the state, but the state sets the broad picture, saying this is how we need to make it happen. This is how it works, because the decisions one city makes does affect the community as a whole and the city down the street. And so we need to work together to make sure that we can continue to have a great quality of life here in Utah. I think that's one of the biggest reasons we all love living in Utah, is the quality of life, and we want to, as we look at doubling the population across the state, and more so along the Wasatch Front, you know, I believe that's how we can work together to try to solve some of these issues.
So let's say the state of Utah puts a policy framework together that provides all the right incentives to do that, creates it, makes it possible, makes it likely. The city says, okay, we'll take a look at that. A developer comes along, they submit a plan, and they say, yeah, we'd like to build some apartment buildings on this spot. Here's what we'd like to do. We can make it pencil and we're good. So the city council holds a hearing, and 400 citizens show up and say, we don't want apartments in our city. We already have too much of this. We all know drug dealers live in apartments. We don't want them here. And the city council says, hey, we'd like to get elected again. We're going to turn the project down. Let's say that unfolds like that. What, if anything, then does the state do about that? If that happens, does the state just say, oh, well, that's up to the city? Or does the state step in and say, yeah, we think there's a compelling interest here for us to get involved, and how do you get involved?
No, I think that's a great scenario, and I think that we have seen that. And by the way, to me, and the way I look at it, it's not just about apartments and high density, because you know, people that are going to use transit, they don't always want to live in apartments. They don't always want to live on a medium density lot. Some of them want to live on a larger size lot. So I think it's important, and that's why I say mixed use, right? Mixed use zoning, and so it's not just apartments. So I think that's one critical component to it, that it's other things besides just high density. But we do see that, and that scenario has happened and is continuing to happen. And I think, you know, again, you know, we need to look at the broader picture of the community as a whole and what's best for that. And if the state can give some cover to officials, I think that that's a great way to move forward, and to say, you know, we understand your concerns, but we also have to look at what the state says is good for the Utah as a whole, and we need these tools here in this area to meet that, and give the cities a little cover politically to help with that. And again, to me, and that's one of the things I love most about Utah, is our ability to work together to find solutions. I wish the federal government and even some other states would follow Utah's lead. You know, I have, well, my wife doesn't think I have any good ideas, but I think I have a few good ideas. I know a lot of the people at the table here has great ideas, and I know working with staff, working with planning commission members and city council members to come up, and mayors, to come up with solutions to our problem. If we have that ability to work together, I think that's what's most important.
And I'd like to maybe talk at a 30,000-foot level for a minute. Back when before our Constitution was actually put in place, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Everybody knows life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What a lot of people don't know is before happiness, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And property rights were equated to happiness. There were landlords. People couldn't own property. You look around us, and most of the wealth we have, whether it's our home, if we're a business person, the business we own, or it's the property we own. And it gives us the ability to have wealth and to have ownership and to have sense of purpose. And we are in an industry that I think has one of the greatest on the planet because of that. If you look around, most of your neighbors, again, if it weren't for their property rights, we'd be in a whole different society, quality of life-wise. The challenge we have is, and I think has been talked about, is how do we get orderly development? How do we maintain those property rights, whether you're an existing landowner or whether you want to develop? And that is a real difficult thing. So because property rights are so essential, we set up a system in the state, and property rights shouldn't be political. And that's why we have a planning commission. And planning commissions aren't voted in. It's not just because you want the planning commission to shield the city council for the 400 people that come opposing the project. The reason planning commissions exist is because they're appointed. They shouldn't be elected. So they ought to be able to make good land use decisions without having to worry about being reelected. And a lot of times that doesn't happen, okay? And we all know that because they're in our neighborhoods, or we see them at, you know, Sundays, or we see them other times, and it's really hard to vote against your neighbors. So we want orderly development, and we see a lot of master plans, and I want to tell you that I've had property that I've owned that's been master planned commercial. You go in to get the rezone, and the city council has not rezoned it, or that we've had multifamily or something and master plan for high density housing, and you get the group coming in and they don't follow their master plan because of what's gone on, and basically public clamor. So the issue is, how do we handle public clamor, and then what happens? And I would say many projects, whether they've been commercial or multifamily, I can think of many of them, and a lot of you know some of the projects we've done. If you were to remove those projects, or you were to shut them down, the neighborhood would actually be very upset after having them in. And we know what NIMBYs are. They're not in my backyard. And I'll talk later. Maybe I could give up the mic because I want questions and answers. But how do we move that through that public process? And what role does the state have in trying to incentivize or give, for lack of a better term, political cover or help to the cities? There are great minds in this room. I see lots of friends. There's great minds inside of the league, and there's great real estate minds that hopefully can come together to find a balance, to be able to allow us to have that orderly development, to have that quality of life. I have simple math. There's jurisdictions that I built homes in that want 1 acre lots. There are jurisdictions that will allow me to build townhomes at maybe 10 lots to the acre. If I have 100 people come into the community and I build on 1 acre lots, that's 100 acres. If I have somebody come into the community and I can do 10 units to the acre, that's 10 acres. We're not going to be able to sustain 100-acre type of developments, and I don't think people want it.
So I'm Representative Dan McKay. I represent Riverton, Bluffdale, a little bit of Harriman. We're one of the higher growth areas in the state, and a lot of these growth issues that everyone's dealing with are, you know, really our bread and butter, what we're trying to figure out now.
You've heard me speak a lot about infrastructure. Biggest issue that this state faces is growth. We're going to double in population in 30 to 40 years. Think about it. How does that feel? It's not going to be in Wayne County. It's probably not going to be in San Juan County. It's going to be in Washington County and along the Wasatch Front, maybe in Cache County a little bit, Box Elder and so forth. So, yeah, this is a big issue. And it boils down to land use. No matter how you cut this up, it boils down to land use. And we got to be smart about our land use decisions. Referendum last year here in Sandy, the mayor was up for re-election and was unelected for a lot of reasons with regards to his policies on density. I know his opponent, Mayor Blackburn, was campaigning against a lot of those issues that Mayor Dolan had espoused for a long time, and I think at least one other mayor was unelected over this issue of land use. It was in Riverton and Harriman. Okay, so which means that we're not doing the job that we need to do as far as educating the population. They need to know that we're going to be doubling in population, and it's their children and grandchildren that are going to have to deal with the congestion, the lack of recreational assets, the impacts on our educational system. All those are a big deal. I always always ask for raising hands, and I'll do that today. How many people in here today are finding it more difficult to get from point A to point B in the last 2 years? Yeah, well now, multiply that, because we cannot keep up with the roads. Guarantee we're not going to be able to keep up with the roads. So it's got to be transit. We've got to look at density. We've got to look at all these issues, and we've got to work together. And the state is grappling with what role they're going to play in this, because we've given land use to municipalities. So maybe here's some of the discussions you need to know. Well, we're going to use the beans. We're going to now distribute road funds that the state collects, the state gas tax. We're going to start distributing them based on those who are willing to step up to the plate and deal with the density issue. We're going to provide other funds for transit, and we're going to base that on your willingness and a community's willingness. And if you don't want those funds, you want to go on your own, then you can do that. So we're not here to hammer it, but it'll be an incentive type of situation. We have to deal with this. And and part of the reason for this discussion about density is the cost of housing is out of control. People aren't going to be able to afford it. Materials, labor, land, impact fees, everything has been going up. And now interest rates are going up. And so it's more and more, it's going to be more and more difficult for my children and my grandchildren to afford, even though we may have some great paying jobs here. If the housing costs are going up faster than the income, we're going to be facing more homeless. We're going to be facing people living in the complete outskirts of, I'm talking in counties that really have no population now, and how do you get them into the workplace? The ideal situation, so that we're not spending billions and billions of dollars on infrastructure that we don't need to, is to get workplace and workforce concentrated in certain areas around transit corridors. Now, maybe technology, maybe self-driving cars is going to answer this question for us. But we don't know that. And the thought of a self-driving car still scares me to death. And it ought to scare us all to death. Because, what happens if there's a glitch, in the software? And so that's got to be perfected before I think we're willing to accept those kind of solutions. And until we can accept those solutions, these are the hard questions that we've got to face going forward. And I'm just going to put a plug in for one of the infrastructure items that is going to be so important to us. It's roads, it's water, it's recreational assets, more trails, more places to water ski, more places to snow ski. We're going to need all of that. And there's resistance to a lot of that. And responsibly impacting those public lands, but doing it in a way that creates opportunity for people to recreate. That's why we live here. That's why we enjoy Utah. And so we're going to have to deal with that. But it's our educational system. Everywhere I go, I run into company owners who say, if we only had more qualified people, we could expand. We have so many jobs available here. But because we don't, we're having to locate some operations, smaller divisions outside of Utah, or they just, or they're not expanding at the rate that they could, given if they had the workforce. And so I think workforce has to be one of our number one objectives. If we can educate our growing population and give them the skills, which means that maybe they don't go to a 4-year college, they're doing it at a technical college, getting the skills that will pay them a very significant wage and will meet some tremendous needs. You know, we always talk about engineers, but one engineer probably, for every engineer, we need probably 15, 20 skilled labor. And they just need those technical skills. And we worry about economic development, bringing companies in here. If we have the trained workforce, we won't need economic development. There is so much demand for a skilled workforce, a young and vibrant workforce, that naturally we will have companies locating here. There'll be high-paying jobs and will be of great benefit to us and help us pay for the very expensive infrastructure. These are big highways, these are big water projects that we will need to invest in for the future. And by creating the density, you will reduce that impact by billions of dollars, because when you spread that out, it's just a lot more infrastructure than when you'd have to do it in a density situation.
For much of what the four of you have just said, city leaders around the state would say amen, because they feel the frustrations of residents, because local leaders are on the front line of population growth. There are three things I just want to quickly touch on that I think will help frame the rest of this conversation. And first is that the League, in conjunction with the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce and Wasatch Front Regional Council, wanted to get a better understanding of what's really driving the frustration and anxieties of residents about population growth. You heard Senator Adams reference NIMBYism. And we wanted to know, who are the people who are NIMBYites or NIMBYists, NIMBYites, whatever, people who don't want development in their community. Who are they, and what is actually driving the frustration? Because I think far too often we fall into a tendency to just assume what is driving the anxiety. So we commissioned a survey that Y2 Analytics did, 2,213 respondents in the 9 fastest growing counties in the state. Diehl, that includes Washington County, so you guys were not ignored in that statewide survey. I went to multiple focus groups in Riverton, representative, soon to be senator, and you've heard from many of these same neighbors, I'm sure, because what our survey found was 63% of Utahns, this has a margin of error of 1.8%, 63% of Utahns feel like Utah is growing too quickly. Then we started doing a deep dive as to why. And some of the responses are really enlightening for those of us who care about infrastructure. For example, 87% of the respondents believe that increased traffic and congestion always accompany growth. We asked about crime. We asked about different types of housing. We asked if people were aware of different developments in their community. And it was really remarkable how aware the residents were of the changes that were happening in their community. Now, it's easy to dismiss some of the frustrations as you moved there 3 years ago and now you want to pull up the bridge over the moat. But it was actually less about change in general and more about feeling like promises had been made that for whatever reason, real or perceived, had not been kept. And those promises invariably revolved around infrastructure. They revolved around whether or not there was sufficient water for development. They revolved around whether or not there were sufficient roads and even transit. The focus groups in the Southwest Valley, it was really interesting to listen to them for several hours that night, because they kept coming back to more and more new housing units, particularly in multifamily units, and asking, how are these people going to get around? We can't handle an additional new house, let alone an additional new 30,000 people based on the infrastructure we currently have. So we started doing some digging to get a better understanding of the land use in, for this particular case, the southwest part of Salt Lake County. And it was fascinating to see that the perception of a Harriman or a South Jordan that they are primarily single-family houses is actually not in line with the reality on the ground. So for example, if you look at the entitled lots in Harriman, 42% of those are multifamily. In South Jordan, if you look at the entitled lots and existing units in South Jordan, it's actually 44%. So you start to see why the residents look at multifamily housing and say this is just more people on top of infrastructure that we don't already have. Then we asked, okay, let's look on the ground at the infrastructure that's available in that particular corner of the valley. And you have one bus route through South Jordan City, you have one bus route through Riverton City, you have a TRAX line that extends through South Jordan but does not connect into Riverton, Harriman, or Bluffdale, and you start to see why people are frustrated with transit and voted against Prop 1 in 2015, saying you want to collect more money from us, but we're not seeing any of the benefit from transit. Well, then you look at the benefits of transit in other parts of the Wasatch Front. I remember when light rail first opened at the old smokestack site in my hometown of Murray, and it was a novelty. I remember going there. It was a big ribbon cutting ceremony with former Mayor Dan Snar, a big mustache, you may remember him. It was in December, it was cold, and we all hopped on the train, and what did? We went downtown to see the lights at Temple Square, because that was really the only reason to take TRAX back in 1999 was to go downtown. Well, fast forward 19 years, and what you've seen around all of these light rail stops in Salt Lake County is you've seen what? You've seen mixed-use development, you've seen housing development, and you started to see a shift. The infrastructure came, and the development patterns followed, and you did not actually see the uproar from residents about that sort of smart growth around transit stops. You certainly do see uproar from residents around change, period. I don't want to diminish that piece, but it is less when, and the data in the Y2 survey demonstrates this, it's less when they feel like their concerns are heard about infrastructure and the area is well planned. And cities are responsible for planning just like the private sector bring in the projects. It's a joint effort, and the survey results actually showed when we asked who should be responsible for planning for growth, who should be responsible for ensuring necessary infrastructure, the city had the plurality of 39%, but the legislature was 22%, developers 21%, the governor 13%. So it was actually fairly close of all of us having those different roles to prepare for infrastructure.
Combine legislature and governor, that's basically the same number.
Yeah, if you come,
Right.
so yeah, kind of the state.
People
Yep.
don't see a difference between the legislature and the governor.
What Representative soon-to-be Senator McKay said is people don't see the difference between the legislature and the governor, and they just see state needs to step up on infrastructure, and cities need to plan for it and pay for infrastructure. And the last piece I'll add about the transit-oriented developments is what we've seen just since 2014 is cities taking advantage of what's known as the Transportation and Land Use Connection Program. It's a program that Wasatch Front Regional Council started, and now there are 66 projects on a shoestring budget where Wasatch Front Regional Council has been able to provide consulting work and other technical assistance to communities, and many of those revolve around transit stops and in the transit corridors. So we've seen 66 projects just since 2014, and we could really go transit stop by transit stop up and down the blue line, the red line, the green line, and you can see how the land use has developed, whether it's West Valley City and Fairborn Station and what's happening there, and the anchor of that is the light rail stop and the connectivity and the connection to the freeway system there, or it is the redevelopment of 4th South between the University of Utah and downtown Salt Lake, or the massive redevelopment along the S line with Market Square and South Salt Lake to Sugar House. You're seeing the development patterns change, and you're seeing the residents are less frustrated by it because they feel like it's well planned. So then the question is, what comes first, the infrastructure or the planning? And how do we get there so we have the orderly development that Senator Adams referenced?
As legislators, if you guys have a bill that comes in front of you and you're trying to decide whether to vote yay or nay on that bill, and it's a bill that has implications on state control versus local control in the land use arena, and I used at the beginning, I used the inland port bill that I think all 4 of you voted for, and so that I think is illustrative, but I don't want to limit my question to that. Just on a global level, if you're trying to decide how to vote on that issue, what factors do you look at to determine, am I going to vote yes or no on this? In other words, am I going to support what could be construed as an usurpation of some local power to the state? or am I going to vote against that? What factors? What do you look at, and kind of how do you go about making that decision? Dan, let's start with you since you were short.
Yeah, I was going to say, I always look at the magnitude of the failure at the local level, right? So, and this comes up every year, the local control concept of what's the state versus what's the local. And I'm always trying to discern the magnitude of the impact of the local failure and its impact on the state's economy and, the state's well-being overall. And when that failure is great, the greater the magnitude of that failure, the more likely it is that the state action is required, right? And so, so you can take the inland port as an issue, and you can say, well, were there specific blockades that were preventing action occurring? And we could see systematic failures, at least from the state level, on getting an action plan in place and having something happen. So I think for me, that's where I start, is what's the systematic failure and what's the magnitude? And once I figure out that, then I can ask Senator Adams what to do.
Awesome. What about the rest of you? What do you look at?
We could talk about specifics, but I'm going to put maybe a shout out for the Land Use Task Force. I see Chris Gambrulis in the back and Gary Crane, both that sit on that task force. And in the past, and I've been around maybe too long. I've been on a planning commission, a city council, and been in the House and now in the Senate. But in the olden days, we had a lot of impact fees. We had a lot of problems. And most of those problems came up, and as we looked at it as a legislature, we'd have the land use people over here and the municipalities over there, and it was a fight, and it was a difficult process. But the new process is you get together and you put people on both sides of the issue together, and amazing things happen when you talk and work things out and figure out the process. So the number one thing I'd look at is what's the vetting process? Has this issue been vetted? Have the stakeholders been talked to? Who's it affecting? And then of course the bottom line is how does it affect property rights and what it does to property rights, whether it takes them away or increases them. But there are great processes we have, and I think part of that vetting process is something I would look at.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Senator and Mike, for the question. I think that's a great question. And I'm going to talk a little bit on that, the inland port bill, because I do think that's such a great example. But I look at the big picture. How does it affect the community as a whole? And for me, it was important that Salt Lake City had a seat at the table because they should be heard. Their concerns should be heard. However, it's not just Salt Lake City that is affected by the inland port. It's the whole community. Citizens in my district, which is in Davis and Weber counties, are affected by the inland port and will be affected by the inland port. And so not just the community, but the state as a whole. And so I try to look at the big picture, make sure all the stakeholders have a seat at the table. And again, I think the more voices, if they'll show up, that's a great point. But I think that the more people you get working together, and again, it's kind of what I led off with. One of the things I love about the state, I think good things happen. We'll not. I don't always get what I want. Salt Lake City shouldn't always get what they want. Industry shouldn't always get what they want. But everybody working together, hopefully we can find solutions that address the big picture and the goals moving forward.
Is it true that Schultz doesn't always get what he wants? Is that true, really? I haven't seen it. I'm just saying. President, so far the answer is we're going to look at the extent of failure at the local government level. We're going to look at the vetting process, and we're going to look at the extent to which that issue transcends just being a local impact and has more of a regional or statewide impact. So those are the answers so far. President, what would you add to that?
Really not much. I think that was well articulated. When it crosses jurisdictional lines, that is appropriate for the state to step in. And the other thing is if the communities aren't acting, and it's been, and the time for a certain issue has taken a long time, but it's an important public policy issue, there would be, I think, a narrative for the state to step in and encourage that issue along, so that, because, at some point that becomes an urgency, and it's better to work on it when it isn't an urgency. And so it's a combination of all these things. And then, of course, emotion gets involved in the legislative process at times, and we try to keep that out. And we do a pretty good job at it, when compared to a lot of legislative bodies across the country, including Congress. But we're not immune to that. That's a reality. And so we accept that as a part of the process. But I think if we can get ahead of these things and work on them earlier, you avoid a lot of that.
Okay.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
I'm disappointed that nobody said that they asked me. Right? Right, I realize there's a legislative question, but I think it's very.
So Cameron,
very insightful.
what factors do you wish they
Well,
would
thank
look
you,
at?
Mike. Thanks for asking. No, and the reason I grabbed the mic though is one thing we did this past session to try to address the concerns you guys have just brought up, because I think you're all right about how you should be looking at these bills, is we went to, and we're going to continue it, a policy-based approach to legislation, where we're asking key questions of each bill to help inform legislators of kind of the balance between the state and the local involvement in each bill. But I think this is very insightful, and I'm glad that you rely on Gary Crane, because I rely on Gary as well.
Real quick, I just want to give the League of Cities and Towns a shout out and tell them thank you, because originally they were opposed to this bill. It passed, but they still kept working with the state to come to solutions. They said, these are our problems, these are our issues, these are the things we need to work on, and the group got together, they worked it out. I think most of those issues were addressed, and so I think it's so important that we all have a seat at the table to look at this, and I just want to give the league credit, because it's not easy, right? I mean, but they recognize that it's big enough, a big enough state issue, and goes beyond just one city's jurisdictional bounds and territory, and affects the state as a whole. And so I think that's one thing that I, again, just love about Utah, is they're willing to come together to solve problems.
Okay. So we have 4 key policymakers here at the table, all of whom have a real estate and development background. This is your opportunity to ask them any question you would like to ask about this subject, or if you just want to vent or get something, off of your chest, or just give them a piece of your mind, that'd probably be okay too. Just watch your language, Baird, wherever you are.
I've got maybe 3 just general questions. One is, as you talk about high density, define high density, what your view is of high density. Second is, how do you look at the Envision Utah's 3% solution as a means to address the issues you're talking about? And then the third one is, as you talk about infrastructure, especially maybe some of the older communities, how do you address an infrastructure that is not being maintained and has no mechanism to maintain itself under the present scenarios we talk about, whether it be our taxing policy on property taxes for residential uses at 55%, or there's not a real means for those communities to get their infrastructure up to date to meet the growing demands. And there's really no other mechanism out there to afford it, other than the city's going into debt to upgrade those systems. So I know there's kind of 3 general questions, but I just kind of like to get your view on those items, what the real definitions are of those.
So let's do those in order. Let's start with density, maybe. You guys.
Okay, I can hit on density and
Yeah.
add any other.
Yeah, we can jump in.
So my view on density, so we've all seen a ton of apartments being built across the Wasatch Front over the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years, and I think maybe 6 to 8 years rather, and I think you see that for several different reasons. And so I take the view of high density as not just apartments, but I do think a lot of the land use decisions that are being made determine whether or not people live in apartments. And let me kind of explain to you a little bit about what I mean by that. As I see it every day, I have people calling me every day looking for houses that are affordable, right? We all know housing affordability is a huge issue in Utah today. One of the things that I see, well, let me first back up. I think I keep hearing this notion that millennials want apartments. Millennials want to live in apartments and different things today, and that's why we're building all these apartments. I don't buy into that notion. I do believe that millennials are more accepting of apartments, but I think the reason why you're seeing apartments become more and more sought after. And by the way, we're building record amounts of apartments the last 5 to 6 years, and we're still seeing very high occupancy rates. We're still seeing high rent growth, which shows that there's a high demand for these apartments. And I think one of the biggest reasons is that's what people can afford. And so I think cities should look at other tools besides just high-density apartments to meet the needs. I think that you look at really small lots. People are more accepting today, and they actually would rather have small lots. I look at our communities where we build really small lots in, and it's hard, where we build on really small lots, it's hard to keep those, to build the houses fast enough on that. But yet we have hundreds of lots that are quarter acre and above scattered all across the Wasatch Front. And so I think if cities look at to help address the high density and address the affordable housing issue, I think if you look at really small lots and you look at townhouse options and different things, I think that those are things that our citizens and our kids and our grandkids are looking for, because that's what they can afford. And when they can't find those options, then they're forced into apartments.
Any other thoughts on density, and then we'll move to the next question.
Yeah, I think density is relative. I mean, you don't laugh. I mean, I live in an RS zone in Layton. RS zone's a 15,000 square foot lot. When we rezoned that to RS for a 15,000 foot lot, was one of the worst rezones we've been through on a 15,000 foot lot. We built 6,000 square foot lots. We've done townhomes. All of them are hard. And then you add apartments onto that. I mean, I know there's communities that want acre lots. Go try to get a half-acre lot zone in a community that wants an acre lot. I mean, density is relative, and that's what we're talking about here, is that if we don't change our mindset as to what is density, I think we've got a problem. And so, and I think Representative Schultz is exactly right. This is market-driven. This is not developer-driven. If you think a developer is going to build an apartment complex that's going to be 50% occupied, you don't understand the market. And we're responding to the market. And what we need to do is we need to try to drive prices down so we can have more people own rather than rent. And the problem is you can't get the zoning for even small lots. Try to get a 6,000 square foot lot zone.
So I'm going to address this just a little bit differently from the density standpoint, just because these two have made great points. I just want to talk about a moral obligation we as a community have to provide to have housing available for people, right? We all, we've done a lot of things about homelessness over the last couple of years as well. And we've had mixed success one way or another. We all know that owning a home is, regardless of its size, is still part of the American dream. I have an 18-year-old daughter, or a 17-year-old daughter, and those of you who have a 17-year-old daughter, you know that for the next, for the last year, and for at least the next 5 years, she knows a lot more than me. And in one of her recent complaints about her landlord, she was expressing how much better it might be to somewhere else. So I encouraged her to put together a budget. What it might look like as an 18-year-old when she moved, because literally the minute she turns 18 on September 30th at 3:01 p.m., and she reminds me the countdown of what that looks like. I think that's what it's like having an attorney / legislator, as a father. So I encouraged her to go make a budget, and I said, what would it take for you to live the current lifestyle you have now and live within a 5-mile radius? So she did. She went and put together a budget of what it would look like, and she quickly realized that she needed to make about $50,000 a year to have the present lifestyle that she has, right? She has a car, she has insurance, she has all these other things. She's got a phone, she's living the dream. She doesn't have an airplane, Mike, like they do in Hooper, but you know, they got, you know.
Those are for crop dusting, though.
Yeah,
that
this is
doesn't
definitely
count.
for
It's
crop dusting. So, and his boots, right? So, so I'll just say, I think we as a society, it's pretty sad, honestly, for me, when I think about the moral obligation we have from a housing perspective, that our kids are forced to move so far away from us, to be part of, to be part of society, to capture the American dream. They got to move really, really far away. The best planning articles, I just spent time with ULI, and the best planning, when you think about urban planning and how it all comes together, the best planning has the ability within a radius of where someone grows up to cover every cycle of their life. So, really small when they're just getting out on their own, and bigger towards the, additional income years, and then smaller on a golf course somewhere. Sorry, that's my dream, not everyone's, but smaller on a golf course somewhere so they don't have to maintain it, right? With an airplane and Hooper. So those things being said, I think if you look around several of our Wasatch communities, and we apply, a lot of our general plans are at least 10 years old, if not older. And if you take that and look backwards, a lot of us still are programming quarter-acre lots and larger on our general plans. And I think when you look at the price of what a quarter-acre lot is and what a home on a quarter-acre lot is, you realize our kids, that's not an affordable lot anymore. It just isn't. And when you have $200,000 to $300,000 condos being built in Harriman, right? Now you're starting to realize, well, that's a condo. These aren't homeless drug addicts that are living in $200,000 to $300,000 condos. These are small, young families that are upstart, and they are looking to move to the next house and be in the next move up. I think we as a community in the state of Utah have a moral obligation to make sure we don't continue pushing our kids further and further away from where we live today.
Dan, I too have a 17-year-old daughter, and having ridden in the car with her 100 times while she's driving, Wayne, that's why I do not fear self-driving cars, my friend. I welcome
That car
any
already
computer.
is self-driving, right?
Any computer. I welcome that.
So I'm just briefly, it may look like this, and it is all relative. It may be in a community like Bluffdale, and instead of doing 1-acre lots, we're doing 8,000 square foot lots, creating some density bonuses, and then putting a bunch of it in open space and creating a trail system for a more healthy lifestyle for our residents. That's what density might look like in some communities. But I think what we're trying to get across here is that we're going to have more density. And that is going to be higher density in some places and not as high density in other places. But in this, let's be smart. Let's give some density bonuses, put some infrastructure in, create some trails. That's what people enjoy. That's what people like. And we're going to need those kind of assets, so everybody can have those opportunities.
And so just to summarize that, I hear you saying we just need to look at outside of the box of the conventional, what we've always assumed, half-acre lots, right, for detached housing. We need to look at alternative forms of housing, alternative size lots. In my neighborhood in West Kaysville, we had a piece of ground being developed right next to where I live, and a petition made its way to my door, and literally the top of the petition said, "Stop Kaysville City from allowing high-density housing in your neighborhood." And when I looked at the recommended plat map below, the average size lot that they were recommending, 0.41 acres, average size lot. But because it was less than half an acre lot, my good neighbors who I love, God help them, they were literally passing a petition around the neighborhood to stop that high-density project. So it is relative. And I'm going to come back to your other questions if we have time, but I want other people to have a chance here. So what do we got? Brent Bateman. No, use the mic, Brent, here.
So my question, I'm in a unique situation as the property rights ombudsman because I talk to the people. The neighbors call me, the mayors call me, the city council persons call me, the developers call me. And my question is this: how are we going to get this message to the people who need to hear the message? We're talking about our moral obligation, the way we need to change our thinking. Well, whose thinking needs to change? I know a lot of the people in this room, most of what we have here, and not all, but mostly is attorneys, staffers, city staffers. They get it, okay? A lot of elected officials, some get it and some don't, but a lot of the ones who we are looking at as the problem, they've said this to me. As a matter of fact, somebody said this to me just a few days ago. I have a moral obligation to stop density. I have a moral obligation to stop development because that's what the people want, and that's why they voted for me. That's why they elected me. My moral obligation to do that is more important than my moral obligation to follow the law, even. And people have actually said that to me. And then the neighbors who call me all the time, I need to stop density. Well, don't you understand that we need affordable housing for people? Yeah, I do, but somewhere else. So my question is, how do we get this to the people who need to hear it?
And so, President, let's start with you. How do we get that word out? And then if I could just put a twist on that as well. As legislators who represent a constituency, what do you do if you look around and just go, yeah, I think the people are wrong on this. I don't think they have the same information we have. I might vote in a different way than what we're hearing about because I'm not sure they've got the whole story. So maybe you could kind of respond to it in both of those ways. So, President, what do you think?
Well, we're probably the wrong organization to ask about that because we do a very poor job as a legislature in educating the public on the issues we face during the legislative session. And mainly that's because we're flying by the seat of our pants most of the time, just drinking from a fire hose. And consequently, there's only so much energy that I have towards a specific issue. And so we've got to look at organizations like, you got to look at the Realtor Association, the Home Builders Association. You got to look at, I see Robert Groh in the audience here today, Envision Utah. And maybe we need to, Envision Utah, I think, does a great job in going out and kind of testing the waters, taking the temperature of the people, bringing back data that we can use as a legislator and as a legislature and as municipalities and counties and so forth. But then also being able to support them in a community, in the education of the community through, they've had some amazing ads that kind of that make people stop and think, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. And so getting creative, supporting the organizations that can help us to educate the folks, getting the data out there, helping people understand this is the data. It's interesting. I think a lot of the people that are complaining about density are people that, maybe have 3 to 6 children. But those children they're going to need to afford some housing. And right now, they're not going to be able to afford housing if there isn't more density in a relative way, obviously. So I think those are the types of organizations we need to support, get behind. Let's get an effective community education. The marketing of that needs to get out, and they do it. Envision Utah is doing that now, and doing it well, and we just need to support that more.
The Salt Lake City Chamber of Commerce is also launching a campaign. Is anyone here from the chamber, by the way?
Mike, I'm part of that, so I could
Yeah,
actually
go ahead,
address that
Cameron.
piece.
Talk about that, and then we've got a question here and a question there. So we'll
Perfect.
move on.
I know Bryn's here from the chamber.
Yeah, I thought I saw
Oh, yeah,
Brent earlier.
Brent's
So,
over here.
Brent, if he screws it up, you fix it, okay? We'll let Cameron take a shot here.
Ultimately, I think that the people in this room and policymakers and planners and others are out in front of the general public. And that's what our data demonstrated to us. Brent, that's your experience every day. The underlying message is really that nostalgia is not a policy, and that longing for what used to be what everybody expected is not a sustainable future. And that we do have to have this paradigm shift, and density varies depending where you are, but it does require this density shift. What we at the League attempted to do this past interim is we made the entire focus of our annual convention about population growth and the changing world. In fact, we actually had a developer from out of state come speak to several hundred city officials at our lunch about the obstacles that cities create to affordability. And in fact, I had somebody come up to me afterward and ask me, did Ivory Homes sponsor that lunch? And in hindsight, I should have asked them to help cover the costs. But the point is we were trying to facilitate uncomfortable conversations with our city leaders, recognizing that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if my colleagues up here on this panel make the decision or if a city leader makes the decision. If the residents are still mad and still don't catch the vision, then we still haven't really moved the ball down the field. And policymakers can either lead by vision or they can lead by fiat. And in order to lead by vision, you need to actually educate the general public. So that's where this effort comes in with the Salt Lake Chamber, and the League's part of this effort. And in fact, they presented the first test run with Penn and Powers yesterday at Capitol Hill to the Commission on Housing Affordability to start a communications campaign using traditional media and social media to articulate to Utahns about what housing affordability, affordable housing, the housing gap, and population growth, all four overlapping but distinct things, what that means to our quality of life today and what it means to us in the future. If we don't change the hearts and minds of the general public, then a lot of this just becomes academic. And so that's what we've been trying to do with our membership, since they're the ones on the front line, but it really needs to be a comprehensive effort. And in fact, one of the appeals that the Chamber made yesterday to the Commission on Housing Affordability was an ongoing state appropriation. So that'll be my pitch to the three of you who will still be in the body in January, is it makes sense to allocate some money and build off the great work that Envision Utah's done and start having this conversation broadly with all of our constituents.
And Bryn, just raise your hand. This is Bryn from the Salt Lake City Chamber. If you guys feel strongly about that subject, they are doing, I mean, that is a Herculean effort, what they are doing, and it's awesome. And so find Bryn and give the Chamber some money and help out financially. The extent to which we're successful in educating the public really, by and large, is determined by resources, right, Bryn? So, yeah, you know, there's no pride here. You guys are taking money, right? If someone wants to contribute to that.
This is like a chamber telethon all of a sudden.
Yeah,
Mike.
exactly.
Do you have a phone number we can flash up on the screens for everybody to donate now, or what? Venmo?
Okay, we've got a question here, and then we'll go back to Bruce.
I've just got a quick question on with the higher density. I've got a few developments where they are actually two developments or smaller lots, but they are approved for accessory dwelling units. Other lots are called estate lots, and they are looking at where they wouldn't necessarily be accessory dwelling units. They are looking at larger homes, multiple larger homes on one lot. I'm interested in how you track that density, how you transfer that density legally, because it wouldn't just be like a mother and father living in the other house. It would be, transferred to somebody else, but yet that one lot is owned by one individual. Would you handle that as air rights, or how do you handle accessory dwelling units on one lot to increase the density?
I know a lot of the cities are wrestling with this question now. I forgot to disclose my initial bias. My wife is actually on the Riverton City Council as well, which makes my world really interesting on this subject and several others, by the way. So I'll just say accessory dwelling units is one way of taking existing product that we have in place now and adding to its density. It's one way of doing it, right? And I think it's one of the smaller legs of the stool that I think will be looked at from a policy perspective. How the legal rights and how they should transfer and whether or not they transfer. I mean, it's really up to the individual, at least currently, the law, whether or not those credits are, quote, transferable and those kinds of things are really up to the municipality at this point. We have, as a state, haven't stepped into creating, density transfer credits or those kinds of things. Not that that's a bad idea. And I think, as President Niederhauser's outlined, having a policy that's based on incentives is valuable. There are lots of risks, though, in adding accessory dwelling units, because remember, if everything is a funnel and we're all trying to get to I-15, right, and we have massive traffic based on the infrastructure we have currently, right, based on the planning that we did 20 years ago, which we all know could use an updating. If we look at that planning element, though, and say, okay, if we just double the amount of people that are using that existing infrastructure without investments in that additional infrastructure, I would argue the accessory dwelling is going to fail, just like it will fail if we just start throwing 20-story condo high-rises out in Harriman with no major transportation to connect it to anything. And so I think, anyway, I think the market really is going to help us sort a lot of those things out. I think what you hear from a lot of people today, and you hear a lot on this panel, is we want the market to be able to solve it, and we want to balance that with smart growth policies. And where you find that balance in incentives or carrots versus sticks, I think is really where you're hearing a lot of the conversation today at the state level. President Niederhauser's right. I think most of us prefer carrots and using financial incentives to try and achieve these types of growth things. But for me, I represent Riverton, Harriman, Bluffdale, and hopefully soon. These guys keep saying it's inevitable. I disagree with them. I could lose very easily. I could say something really dumb on Twitter, which is not uncommon for me. That being said, but that area, Draper, and I represent Lehigh as well, if you look at the whole Senate district. And that is where the concentration of growth is going on in the state right now. I recognize this is a bullseye right on our backs, so to speak. And I think there's a lot that needs to go into planning how not only what we do in our greenfield development, because that is certainly an element of it, but we have redevelopment that is an important leg of this stool as well, and making sure that we're taking and capitalizing on all the infrastructure we have already in place. And I think that's kind of the three legs of the stool as I look at it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Let's go to Bruce Jenkins here.
So, in listening to a lot of the comments about education, it makes me think that we can bring a horse to water, we can't make him drink. It reminds me, my wife went to Switzerland. She loved the trains. She loved everything. I asked her, would you ever live in a flat or something like that? No, because she's not going to give up her backyard and the car and all those things. And when I hear about, again, the education, I wonder if we could take a lesson from the private sector. Milk industry, they market to the kids in grade school. They get hooked on milk early, young. Pizza is served in our lunchrooms. The fast food industry. Where are they educating? They're educating in our school system. And because this really is a crisis, is there room, and I'll ask the president and others who are looking to that part of infrastructure, is there room to we have sex education courses? Don't we need to be educating the kids? Because as adults, studies will show that at best we're willing to change 5% of our thinking on a good day. And if we think we're going to turn the corner with a bunch of us older farts or medium-aged farts in this room, it probably isn't going to happen.
Bruce Barrett's actually outside the room, so it's okay.
This guy can say that?
Okay, now he's back in. Sorry.
Okay.
Old farts is relevant.
That's relevant. In this state, I can get away with it. But, so my question is this, because it will be a crisis with infrastructure and with the amount of people, is it worth incentivizing that in our education system with the funds you apply to education?
Yeah. Any thoughts there? So the question is, does the legislature incentivize or compel mandatory education on these sorts of subjects in our high schools, junior highs, elementary schools?
I have been the Education Appropriations Chair for the last 2 years in the state. I will say every time society, throws one more log in the fire for education to solve for us, or our education system to solve for us, the more likely we're creating a problem rather than solving it. So that's one element that I'll just kind of throw in there. And I'll let the others, I could keep talking. I'm exercising restraint.
I think I think certainly education is a key component to it, and I think anything that we can look at to get the word out to help people understand. I think there's a lot of people that will understand that, and will understand that we have an issue and we need to work around it. The difference is, I think you can educate people as much as you want to educate people, but when that actually shows up in their backyard, education goes out the window and they don't care. And so I think, so I think kind of a combination of education, carrots, and yes, sticks, I think helps us get everything, get the goals across the finish line and gets people working together.
My good friend Chris Gamvroulis, who is here, is fond of saying that every person he's ever met is pro private property rights until something happens in their neighborhood, right? And then they change.
So Robert Grove has a question. Maybe I'll wait for his before we answer, okay?
Okay, I'm coming over.
So a number of you mentioned the impact of infrastructure, particularly the light rail systems and Front Runner and others that have occurred. About a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, Utahns voted to tax themselves to build out the 2030 transit plan by 2015. And we went ahead and did that. And since that time, we really haven't planned any additional significant transit. And what's interesting, if you look back, for 10 years, we've been producing half our housing units as multifamily in the state. Now, when we went into the recession, people thought that was temporary. But we've now been in the longest recovery, post-war recovery, and that 50-50, or actually Salt Lake County is like 70-30 now multifamily. The Wasatch four-county Wasatch Front is 50-50 Wasatch or multifamily. So do you see a time again when we're going to actually build the rail systems again and more transit? Because 40% of all those housing units have gone within a quarter mile of a rail stop. That's where they are. That's where the majority of them are going, and that potential just keeps rising. We could have 1 million people around those rail stops in another 15 years if we did it. So the question is, do we see that a chance for that to grow again, or just the fiscal pressures on all this infrastructure makes that probably not likely?
Transit innovation is going to have to be part of it. You heard President Niederhauser talk about, I think, in multiple different ways. One is autonomous vehicles. It'll add more capacity. Transit's got to be part of it. We can't, the best example I can see is if those of you that don't live in the south part of the valley but live north, drive through Farmington and Centerville and just kind of look at an aerial Google map and see how many more freeways you can fit between the mountains and the lake. There's not a lot of room. And so transit's got to be part of the solution. But I probably have a personal opinion of this, is that transit needs to be more effective. And I'll just tell you that more efficient. For example, you probably need to have express trains. They need to move faster. I happened to be in Europe and Bern, Switzerland, trying to catch a plane out of Zurich. Was on an express train from Bern to Zurich. 1 hour ride. There wasn't room on the train. People were standing. They were pushing in. It was like going to the University of Utah game, trying to get on the train. And there just wasn't room. I Googled my phone, and in Switzerland, you're traveling 75 miles an hour on their freeways. I went on their phone and said, how long will it take me to drive? 2 hours. When transit becomes that efficient, we're all going to be on it, and that's the goal.
I'll take a little stab at that too, Robert. I agree with you 100%. this last year, we passed SB 136. Most people are probably familiar with that work with the legislature. There's two things. There's a lot of things I didn't like in that bill, and I was a sponsor. That's welcome to Utah and working together, right, to accommodate everybody's needs and solutions. But there's a couple things that I really did like in that bill, and the one we opened up the ability for the state to go and preserve corridors, the corridor preservation, to make sure that we're not building buildings, we're not building houses, we're not building things that might impede a light rail or bus rapid transit or whatever it may be in the areas where we're seeing a lot of growth if we don't have the money to build those yet. And I think that's very important. I hope that the state and local government use that tool that we gave them. Another big thing is the state has not invested in transit yet, even to this day. The state has done a great job building a lot of roads, but the state itself hasn't invested in transit. It's all been done at the local level through local property taxes that's been imposed, most of which have been voted on by the citizens of the state. However, last year in SB 136, we created a revenue source and a mechanism for the state to start investing into transit. And so I hope that we do look at that going forward as a state. And I know that we've created those funds to start doing that.
Okay, we have, President, did you have a comment? We'll do
There's
after
two
President.
key
one more
elements
question.
that I see in answer to this question in SB 136. We expanded the local option. We're going to need to do more of that. Okay, but we made a step towards that. And two, we created a state fund that will be distributed based on commitments from the local entities on these density issues and their effort towards and willingness to execute those local options. We just need to fund it better now at the state level, and that was a difficult situation, is getting it funded and having a revenue stream, but we're gonna need that. And that's what we need to get behind, and it's already set up now, but we need to get that revenue stream for the state, for transit, and then continue to expand local options.
Okay, with
Hey,
that,
Mike,
oh, go ahead,
just
Cameron.
quick 30 seconds. Representative Schultz gave us a shout out earlier about the league working with him on the Inland Port Bill. On SB 136, we worked closely with Representative Schultz and other stakeholders to get to yes on that bill. And as the Senate President referenced, that bill is a game changer. Because for the first time, when the state is programming dollars, they're going to be looking at the local land use and economic development potential. For the first time, the state can invest in transit to build out the transit system in a way, Robert, that facilitates the development that we're just now seeing along the blue line and the red line and the green line and the S line and front runner stops. Fun fact, the city of Lehigh has actually set aside 5 areas for future TODs if and when light rail is extended into Utah County. Spanish Fork has already set aside land and zoned for transit-oriented development for when front runner connectivity expands into Spanish Fork. So the local elected leaders want to see that transit expansion, and it's going to be a collective will, whether it's the fifth that the president referenced, the new sales tax allocated or authorization that came from the bill, or state money, or a combination of both. And ultimately what transit does, or the 6/5 or the 7th, yeah, the 7th. But ultimately what has to happen is you have to change the convenience calculation. Bruce, you mentioned we needing to train young people about what the future looks like. Part of the reason we did the Y2 analytics data is to identify the persuadables so that we can message to them. But at the end of the day, it comes back to convenience. Senator Adams, the reason people take the train up to the U, and I'm one of them, go Utes, the reason is because it's so darn inconvenient to park on campus and get out of there. I know, isn't that great? I got lots of friends. We're leading the Pac-12 South right now. But you have to change the convenience calculation for people's daily lives. And the University of Utah football is a small example of how it got to a point where it's so inconvenient that the train then became more convenient. And that convenience calculation in daily lives is critical.
Okay, we've got time for one last quick question. So we're going to have the question and then maybe 1 or 2 responses.
So we have a jobs housing imbalance. The state has done a lot to incentivize business expansion through GOED's various, post-performance grants. As state legislators, in thinking about the state's role in possibly helping the pro forma equation for private sector development, would you consider a post-performance housing incentive so that we can rebalance that jobs housing equation?
Nothing's off the table.
Senator Adams, did you have something on that?
No, I just say the same thing. We'll look at every option, and that's what we're talking about today. I think we have some of the smartest, hopefully smartest minds in the state here, and those that understand real estate. And if there's something that works, we'd look at it. The only challenge that I have is, again, you've got to watch out. Everything's market driven, and if you make something, if you cause incentivize cash sometimes to chase things, you'll drive up the price outside the market, and it's got to be market driven. So the answer is yes, we'll look at it. We just want to make sure it's right. I mean, we look at everything.
I think a lot of people look at the legislature to solve these problems. We're a lawmaking body, we're a policy-making body, but we're not the be-all, do-all, end-all. Yes, I know, you might think that, but we are, we're pretty, we're not dummies, but we're just like you. We're a common people that you elected to go to the legislature and represent you. That all of a sudden didn't give us some dispensation of vision and smarts. And it's important that we have organizations like the Land Use Task Force. It's important that we're having discussions like this. It's important that we have organizations like Envision Utah and what the chamber is doing. Put together something. Make it based on data and bring those ideas to the legislature. If they're well-vetted ideas that have public support, the legislature can act on those things. But don't expect the legislature to solve all the problems internally. We need the external organizations to bring those. Our wheelhouse, what we do best is pass the policy. So we're not necessarily the best ones to come up with the policy. And I think that's an important point to make.
Okay, thank you. And President, we'll give you the last word, as it should be. Oh, no, we're not. It's just who wants? Oh, Stuart, you're going to take the last word.
Future president wants.
Yeah, I will.
So Mike leaned over and talked to me, but one thing I would like to say, and we can let the president have the last word, but we're talking a lot about education, but all I can say is that get involved. Who are you putting on your planning commissions, and who's going to run for city council here? And who's going to educate if not us? And I'll tell you a final story that Representative Schultz wanted me to tell. I served on a city council for 9 years. And we did a really good job, I think, at trying to do land use decisions. And actually before that was on a planning commission. One particular issue was not a rezone, but was actually a PUD overlay on somebody who already had a zone. And the planned unit was exactly like you said, President. It had some trails, but it was on a hillside, and the developer wasn't prepared, and he just wasn't a very good presentation. But the room, and we had lots of times when the room was filled, but the room was almost this big, and it was overpacked. People were not happy. You had people who used to be your sports coach in high school there. You had neighborhoods people from the neighborhood that were part of your religious organization and community, and no one was happy. Everyone hated this development. And so, again, the developer wasn't very, very well prepared, so we turned down the development. And the city attorney, and he's here, I won't tell you who he was, but he brought us back into a closed meeting. And he says, I'll defend you guys, but he said, this is a conditional use. And if they meet the conditions, you probably have to give them the use. I'll defend you, but we're going to lose, and I just want you to know that. We then made a determination to reconsider our actions. And the following council meeting, even with all those people out there, as a city council, we granted them the use. If you have policies, if you have guardrails in place, you'll have good, orderly development. And I think that's what we're talking about as a legislature, is how to set those policies, how to set those guardrails, because I want to tell you, having served on a city council, I will not say anything bad about anybody who makes a bad decision on a city council. Those are hard decisions. They're not easy. And especially when you've got people in your community that are very close to you and you know very well. But let's give the guidelines and let's work together to figure out what those guidelines are so we give the best possible outcome and orderly development.
That's a great point, and that's why we spend so much time on LUDMA throughout the year, because LUDMA really does provide those guidelines, doesn't it? And then says to individual municipalities, now you go make decisions within these guidelines. And that is clearly a legislative function, right? And that's a great way to sum up, kind of takes us back full circle, Cameron, to where we started the discussion. So thanks. I'm glad you had the last word and not Wayne. That was... You want a rebuttal, President? All right.
Just,
well,
what's coming, so.
Yeah, it's true. All right. Well, let's thank our panelists here for coming and sharing their words.